In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where power shifted like sand beneath the feet of Florence's most ambitious man, Niccolò Machiavelli observed a truth that would echo through centuries: the most dangerous man in any room is not the one who demands everything, but the one who needs nothing. This paradox of power, that true strength emerges not from accumulation but from the deliberate destruction of one's own weaknesses, forms the cornerstone of a philosophy so potent that it transforms ordinary men into forces of nature. The concept of needing nothing does not suggest the absence of desire or ambition. Rather, it represents a state of profound psychological independence where external circumstances lose their power to dictate internal states. When a man achieves this condition, he becomes like a mountain in a storm, unmoved by forces that would topple lesser structures. The silent power that emanates from such a person is not born of aggression or dominance, but from an unshakable foundation built upon the ruins of his former, vulnerable self. Consider the merchant Lorenzo de' Medici encountered in the markets of Florence, a man whose name history has forgotten but whose presence commanded respect from princes and paupers alike. This merchant owned little by conventional standards: a modest shop, simple clothes, basic necessities. Yet when the Pazzi conspiracy threatened to engulf Florence in civil war, when noble families fled in terror and wealthy merchants barricaded themselves behind armed guards, this unremarkable man continued his daily routines with such calm certainty that others began to gravitate toward him seeking stability. His power lay not in what he possessed, but in his complete indifference to loss. The transformation from a man of needs to a man of inner sovereignty begins with a brutal self-assessment that few possess the courage to undertake. Every human carries within themselves a constellation of weaknesses, fears that paralyze, desires that enslave, attachments that become weapons in the hands of others. The process of destroying these vulnerabilities is not mere self-improvement, it is a form of internal warfare where mercy toward one's own frailties becomes the greatest cruelty. For in sparing the weak aspects of our nature, we ensure our destruction by external forces that will show no such mercy. This destruction must be methodical, deliberate, and complete. A man cannot simply suppress his fears, he must understand them so thoroughly that they lose their grip on his imagination. He cannot merely resist his destructive desires, he must transform his relationship with desire itself until he becomes its master rather than its slave. The process resembles a sculptor working with marble. Every chip of stone removed reveals more of the perfect form hidden within, but the work demands both vision and the willingness to destroy what currently exists. The historical figure of Marcus Aurelius provides a compelling example of this principle in action. Despite commanding the greatest empire the world had known, possessing wealth beyond measure, and wielding power that could reshape nations with a word, Aurelius systematically destroyed his attachment to these external goods through daily meditation and philosophical practice. His private writings reveal a man engaged in constant battle against his own tendency toward comfort, pride, and the intoxication of power. By deliberately cultivating indifference to loss, he achieved a form of invulnerability that no enemy could penetrate. When plague ravaged the empire, when barbarian tribes pressed against the frontiers, when political rivals schemed for his throne, Aurelius remained unshaken because he had already surrendered internally everything that others might use to break him. The man who achieves this state of needing nothing discovers that he has accidentally acquired everything of true value. His opinions carry weight because he seeks no validation. His presence commands respect because he requires no recognition. His words possess power because he has no agenda to promote. This paradox confounds those who operate according to conventional models of influence and control. They cannot bribe a man who wants nothing, cannot threaten someone who has already accepted every possible loss, cannot manipulate someone who has destroyed the psychological mechanisms that make manipulation possible. The second part of this transformation involves understanding that vulnerability itself is a choice. Every man begins life as a creature of needs, for food, shelter, safety, love, recognition. These needs create points of leverage that others can exploit. The infant cries and receives attention, learning early that expressing need results in having that need met. This pattern, repeated throughout childhood and into adulthood, creates a psychological architecture where identity becomes inseparable from the satisfaction of external desires. The man who would transcend this condition must recognize that his greatest enemy is not any external force, but the version of himself that believes happiness depends on circumstances beyond his control. This weak self manifests in countless ways: the businessman who measures his worth by his net worth, making him vulnerable to any threat to his fortune, the politician who equates his value with his approval ratings, rendering him a slave to public opinion, the lover who defines himself through his relationship status, ensuring his destruction when that relationship ends. Each attachment creates a hostage that enemies can threaten, a weakness that circumstances can exploit, a dependency that undermines true power. The destruction of this weak self requires more than philosophical understanding. It demands practical exercises that systematically remove the pillars supporting false identity. The Stoic philosophers developed numerous techniques for this purpose, but their methods often remain theoretical abstractions. The man who would achieve true invulnerability must engage in concrete practices that demonstrate to his nervous system, not merely his intellect, that he can survive and thrive regardless of external conditions. One such practice involves deliberately placing oneself in situations that would normally trigger anxiety or discomfort, not for the purpose of suffering, but to prove that comfort is unnecessary for well-being. The wealthy man might spend time living as a pauper to discover that poverty cannot touch his essential nature. The socially prominent individual might choose periods of complete isolation to learn that validation from others is a luxury, not a necessity. The powerful executive might voluntarily surrender authority to subordinates, demonstrating that control over others is less important than control over oneself. These exercises serve a dual purpose. They reveal the illusory nature of most fears while building genuine confidence based on tested resilience rather than untested assumptions. The man who has voluntarily experienced poverty, rejection, failure, and isolation under controlled conditions develops an empirical knowledge of his own durability. When these experiences occur involuntarily later in life, as they inevitably do, he meets them not with panic but with the calm recognition of familiar territory. The monastery of La Verna, where Saint Francis received the stigmata, provides an unexpected example of this principle. Francis began life as the pampered son of a wealthy merchant, surrounded by luxury and social privilege. His transformation began not with a mystical vision, but with a deliberate choice to embrace everything his former self had feared: poverty, social rejection, physical discomfort, and the loss of all worldly status. By voluntarily destroying his attachment to comfort, recognition, and material security, he achieved a form of power that no pope or prince could threaten. His influence stemmed not from what he possessed, but from his visible indifference to possession. Kings sought his counsel because he needed nothing from them, making his advice uniquely trustworthy. The process of self-destruction and reconstruction creates a man who operates according to different rules than those governing ordinary human behavior. Where others see loss, he sees liberation. Where others perceive threats, he recognizes opportunities to demonstrate his independence. Where others experience fear, he feels only the mild interest of one observing a natural phenomenon that cannot ultimately affect him. This transformation does not eliminate human emotions or desires, rather, it changes their quality and function. Emotions become information rather than commands. Desires become preferences rather than requirements. The entire emotional life becomes more vivid and authentic because it operates freely, unconstrained by the desperate need to avoid pain or secure pleasure. This liberated emotional state produces what observers describe as silent power, a quality of presence that needs no external validation or support. The man who has destroyed his weak self moves through the world with the certainty of one who has already faced his greatest fears and survived. His confidence is not bravado or pretense, but the natural expression of tested knowledge. He has learned through direct experience that he is more durable than he previously believed, more adaptable than circumstances require, and less dependent on external conditions than social conditioning suggests. The political implications of this transformation are profound and often dangerous to existing power structures. Most social control depends on the manipulation of human needs and fears. Governments maintain order by threatening punishment and promising rewards. Economic systems function by creating artificial scarcity and manufactured desires. Social hierarchies persist by convincing individuals that their worth depends on their position relative to others. The man who needs nothing stands outside these systems of control, not as a rebel or reformer, but as someone for whom the entire mechanism is simply irrelevant. The court of Louis XIV at Versailles exemplified the systematic exploitation of human weakness for political control. Every aspect of court life was designed to create dependency on royal favor, elaborate ceremonies that required specific clothing and knowledge, complex protocols that could be violated accidentally, and an endless cycle of rewards and punishments that kept nobles in a state of constant anxiety about their status. The few individuals who achieved influence in this environment were those who managed to create genuine independence from the system while appearing to participate in it. The Duke of St. Simon, for example, maintained detailed records of court life precisely because he understood that knowledge was power only when combined with the independence to act on that knowledge without fear of consequences. The modern corporate environment operates according to similar principles, creating artificial hierarchies and manufactured insecurities that keep employees focused on advancement, approval, and job security rather than their actual capabilities and contributions. The individuals who achieve genuine leadership in these environments are often those who have cultivated enough internal independence to act according to principle rather than expedience, to speak truth rather than acceptable platitudes, and to make decisions based on long-term consequences rather than short-term political considerations. The third and most crucial aspect of this transformation involves recognizing that invulnerability is not a defensive posture but an offensive capability. The man who needs nothing becomes incredibly dangerous to systems and individuals that depend on the manipulation of need and fear. His very existence represents a form of rebellion against the fundamental assumptions underlying most human interactions. He cannot be bought, threatened, flattered, or controlled through any of the conventional means that govern social and political relationships. This danger is not theoretical but intensely practical. Consider the example of Epictetus, who began life as a slave in Rome and achieved such philosophical independence that his former masters eventually sought his counsel. His power stemmed not from any external authority, but from his complete indifference to the things that others used to control him. He had been beaten, humiliated, and deprived of basic freedoms, yet emerged from these experiences with deeper knowledge of his own invulnerability. His teachings influenced emperors and shaped the thinking of generations precisely because he demonstrated that true freedom is internal and, therefore, indestructible. The practical application of this principle requires understanding that the destruction of the weak self must be balanced with the construction of something greater in its place. The goal is not nihilistic emptiness or cynical detachment, but the creation of a self that operates according to chosen principles rather than unconscious reactions. This reconstructed identity is not brittle like its predecessor, but flexible and adaptive. It can engage fully with life while maintaining the capacity to withdraw completely when necessary. It can form deep relationships while preserving ultimate independence. It can pursue ambitious goals while remaining indifferent to their achievement. The craftsman provides an excellent model for this balanced approach to self-construction. A master carpenter develops such intimate knowledge of his materials and tools that he can create beauty from the most unpromising raw materials. His skill makes him valuable to others, yet he depends on no single project or client for his sense of worth. He takes pride in excellent work while remaining unattached to praise or criticism. His identity is rooted in his craft rather than his circumstances, making him essentially immune to the external changes that devastate those whose sense of self depends on position, possessions, or other people's opinions. The development of this craftsmanlike approach to life requires years of deliberate practice and constant refinement. It begins with the identification of genuine skills and capabilities that exist independent of social recognition or external validation. These might be intellectual abilities, creative talents, practical skills, or forms of knowledge that have intrinsic rather than merely instrumental value. The key is developing competencies that enhance one's capability for independent action while reducing dependence on others for basic needs and psychological satisfaction. The physician in medieval times who had mastered the healing arts possessed a form of power that was both valuable to others and personally fulfilling. His knowledge could not be taken away by political changes or economic upheavals. His services were needed by rich and poor alike, giving him access to all levels of society while requiring subservience to none. His work provided immediate feedback about its effectiveness, allowing him to develop genuine rather than pretended expertise. Most importantly, his identity was grounded in his ability to heal rather than external recognition of that ability, making him internally secure regardless of his social status. The modern equivalent might be the programmer who has achieved such mastery of his craft that he can create value in any technological environment. His skills are portable across companies, industries, and even countries. His work is immediately testable, preventing the self-deception that plagues fields where competence is subjective. His ability to solve real problems makes him valuable to others, while his independence prevents him from becoming psychologically dependent on any particular employer or project. He has transformed his relationship with work from a source of anxiety into a source of power. This transformation from dependency to independence creates a peculiar psychological phenomenon. The man who needs nothing often finds that others need him desperately. This occurs because genuine independence is extremely rare in a world where most people are driven by unexamined fears and unconscious desires. The person who has achieved true self-mastery becomes like a fixed point around which others can orient themselves. His stability provides a refuge for those caught in the storms of their own emotional chaos. His clarity of vision helps others navigate situations that would otherwise overwhelm them. The historical figure of Abraham Lincoln illustrates this principle powerfully. Despite humble origins and limited formal education, Lincoln developed such profound psychological independence that he became the stabilizing force that held the American nation together during its greatest crisis. His power stemmed not from political connections or inherited wealth, but from his ability to maintain emotional equilibrium while those around him succumbed to panic, hatred, or despair. His famous melancholy was not weakness but evidence of his willingness to feel deeply while remaining uncontrolled by his feelings. His capacity for forgiveness reflected not naivety but the strength that comes from having no psychological need for revenge or vindication. Lincoln's approach to the slavery question demonstrates how the man who needs nothing can navigate impossible political situations that destroy those who are driven by conventional ambitions. He opposed slavery on moral grounds while understanding that immediate abolition would likely destroy the Union and ultimately harm the enslaved people he sought to help. His solution required the patience to work within existing political constraints while maintaining pressure for fundamental change. This delicate balance would have been impossible for someone whose sense of self depended on being seen as consistent, popular, or morally pure. Lincoln's willingness to accept temporary misunderstanding and criticism allowed him to achieve results that more conventional politicians could never have accomplished. The development of this kind of strategic patience requires destroying the aspects of personality that demand immediate gratification or recognition. The weak self wants to be right more than it wants to be effective, to be praised more than it wants to achieve meaningful results, to be understood more than it wants to understand. These priorities, natural and even admirable in ordinary circumstances, become fatal handicaps when dealing with complex situations that require long-term thinking and tactical flexibility. The process of developing strategic patience begins with small exercises in delayed gratification and emotional regulation. The man who would master himself might begin by practicing silence in situations where his normal impulse would be to speak, observing how his internal state changes when he resists the urge to correct others, defend himself, or assert his opinions. These simple practices reveal how much psychic energy is normally wasted on maintaining an image or seeking validation from others. As this practice deepens, the individual begins to notice that his emotional reactions are choices rather than automatic responses. The insult that would normally trigger anger becomes an opportunity to practice equanimity. The setback that would typically cause despair becomes a chance to demonstrate resilience. The praise that would usually generate pride becomes merely information about others' perceptions rather than validation of personal worth. Each situation becomes a training ground for developing the internal capabilities that true power requires. The monastery of Mount Athos in Greece has preserved for over 1,000 years a tradition of practices designed to produce exactly this kind of psychological transformation. The monks who inhabit this remote peninsula have voluntarily embraced a life stripped of conventional pleasures and comforts, not from hatred of the world, but from understanding that attachment to worldly goods creates vulnerability. Their daily practices of prayer, fasting, and manual labor are designed to demonstrate repeatedly that happiness is independent of external circumstances. The most advanced of these monks develop what visitors often describe as an uncanny presence, a quality of attention and awareness that seems to penetrate surface appearances and perceive underlying realities. This presence is not mystical but practical. It represents the natural result of years spent observing the contents of consciousness without being controlled by them. Such men become sources of wisdom not because they have learned special doctrines, but because they have developed the internal stillness necessary to perceive clearly what others miss in the noise of their own mental agitation. The businessman who applies these principles in secular contexts discovers that the same internal qualities that produce spiritual insight also generate worldly effectiveness. The ability to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when others are panicked, to act on principle when others are driven by emotion, these capabilities translate directly into competitive advantages that no amount of education or experience can provide. The executive who has learned to remain unattached to outcomes while working diligently toward goals can take risks that would paralyze those whose sense of self depends on continuous success. This detached engagement creates what might be called the entrepreneur's paradox. The person who cares least about making money often becomes the most financially successful. This occurs because such individuals can see opportunities that others miss, make decisions based on logic rather than fear, and persist through setbacks that would cause attachment-driven people to quit. Their success stems not from desire for wealth but from their ability to serve real needs without being distracted by their own psychological requirements. The venture capitalist who has achieved this kind of internal independence can evaluate investment opportunities with unusual clarity because he has no emotional need for any particular deal to succeed. His detachment allows him to see both the potential and the risks more accurately than investors who are driven by greed, fear, or the need to appear clever. When he does invest, he can provide valuable guidance to entrepreneurs because his advice is not contaminated by his own agenda or insecurities. His portfolio companies succeed more often because they benefit from decision-making that is based on reality rather than wishful thinking or neurotic anxiety. The political leader who embodies these principles becomes extraordinarily effective because he can make decisions based on long-term consequences rather than short-term political advantages. His indifference to criticism allows him to pursue necessary but unpopular policies. His lack of personal agenda enables him to build genuine coalitions with people whose support might normally be impossible to obtain. His emotional stability provides a foundation for others to make difficult decisions that would otherwise be paralyzed by the chaos of competing interests and passionate disagreements. The historical example of George Washington illustrates how this combination of personal detachment and public engagement can reshape entire societies. Washington's decision to surrender power voluntarily after 2 terms as president astonished observers throughout the world, who had expected him to follow the normal pattern of successful military leaders and establish himself as a permanent ruler. His action stemmed not from political calculation but from his complete lack of psychological need for the trappings of power. Having achieved genuine internal authority over himself, external authority held no particular attraction. His willingness to step down established a precedent that has shaped American political culture for over 2 centuries. Washington's approach to the partisan conflicts that emerged during his presidency demonstrates another aspect of the power that comes from needing nothing. Rather than aligning himself permanently with either faction, he attempted to remain above the battle while addressing the legitimate concerns of both sides. This position required enormous personal strength because it meant accepting criticism from all directions while receiving support from none. Only someone who had destroyed his need for approval could have maintained this stance, yet it proved essential for preserving national unity during a period when partisan conflict might otherwise have torn the young republic apart. The cultivation of this kind of internal authority requires recognizing that most human conflict stems from the collision of unexamined needs and unconscious fears. The person who has achieved psychological independence can often resolve disputes that seem intractable to the participants because he can see clearly what each side actually wants beneath their stated positions. His lack of personal agenda allows him to propose solutions that serve everyone's genuine interests while satisfying no one's emotional requirements for vindication or dominance. The master negotiator who operates from this foundation of inner independence achieves results that seem miraculous to those who view negotiation as a zero-sum competition. His success stems from his ability to focus on creating value rather than claiming value, to understand what the other party truly needs rather than what they say they want, and to remain patient while others exhaust themselves with positional bargaining and emotional manipulation. His indifference to winning in any conventional sense allows him to achieve outcomes that are far superior to what either party could have obtained through adversarial approaches. The development of these negotiation skills requires extensive practice in observing one's own emotional reactions without being controlled by them. The negotiator who becomes angry when his proposals are rejected, who feels insulted when his expertise is questioned, or who experiences fear when the other party threatens to walk away, has revealed psychological vulnerabilities that skilled opponents can exploit. The man who has destroyed these reactive patterns can use the same emotions as sources of information rather than triggers for unconscious behavior. This emotional mastery extends far beyond formal negotiations into every area of human interaction. The parent who has achieved this kind of internal independence can guide his children's development without being manipulated by their emotional outbursts or seduced by their temporary approval. His consistency provides the security that children need, while his detachment allows him to enforce necessary boundaries without being cruel or vindictive. His example teaches them that emotional stability is possible and that authority can be exercised without tyranny. The teacher who operates from this foundation can challenge students intellectually without being personally threatened by their resistance or criticism. His classroom becomes a laboratory for developing critical thinking rather than a theater for ego gratification. His students learn not just academic subjects but how to think independently, because they observe daily how someone can remain confident without being defensive, knowledgeable without being arrogant, and demanding without being unreasonable. The physician who has achieved this psychological independence can deliver difficult diagnoses with compassion while maintaining the emotional clarity necessary for sound medical judgment. His patients trust him because they sense that his recommendations are based on their needs rather than his own psychological requirements. His colleagues respect him because his opinions are not contaminated by the need to appear brilliant, popular, or consistently correct. Each of these examples illustrates the same fundamental principle: the man who has destroyed his weak self becomes extraordinarily useful to others precisely because he needs nothing from them. This usefulness translates into a form of power that is both more effective and more sustainable than conventional approaches to influence and control. It requires no external resources to maintain, creates no resentment in others, and actually increases with use rather than being depleted by exercise. The final aspect of this transformation involves understanding that true invulnerability is not a permanent achievement but an ongoing practice. The weak self, once destroyed, has a tendency to regenerate in new forms. The man who becomes complacent about his internal freedom will find that new attachments and dependencies gradually undermine his hard-won independence. The maintenance of psychological sovereignty requires constant vigilance and regular exercises designed to prevent the accumulation of new vulnerabilities. The ancient Stoics understood this principle and developed specific practices for maintaining their philosophical gains. They practiced negative visualization, regularly imagining the loss of everything they valued in order to maintain their appreciation for what they had while preventing psychological dependence on its continuation. They engaged in voluntary discomfort, periodically choosing to sleep on hard surfaces, eat simple food, and go without ordinary conveniences in order to demonstrate to themselves that comfort was not necessary for well-being. These practices might seem masochistic to modern sensibilities, but they serve the essential function of preventing the gradual erosion of hard-won internal freedom. The businessman who has achieved independence from his need for wealth but, then, becomes accustomed to luxury without conscious choice may find that he has accidentally created new dependencies that compromise his decision-making ability. The leader who has overcome his need for approval but, then, begins to enjoy flattery without awareness may discover that he has inadvertently made himself vulnerable to manipulation by those who understand his weakness. The prevention of this gradual deterioration requires establishing regular practices that maintain one's connection to essential capabilities while preventing psychological attachment to non-essential conveniences. The wealthy individual might maintain his ability to live simply by periodically choosing modest accommodations when traveling. The powerful executive might preserve her independence by occasionally performing menial tasks that remind her of her fundamental humanity. The famous artist might protect his creative integrity by regularly working on projects that have no commercial potential. These practices serve a dual purpose: they maintain essential skills while providing regular tests of one's psychological freedom. The person who discovers that he cannot happily sleep in a modest hotel room has learned that his attachment to luxury has compromised his independence. The executive who becomes irritated when asked to perform simple tasks has revealed that her sense of identity has become dependent on her position. The artist who cannot work without the prospect of recognition has demonstrated that his creativity has become enslaved to his ego. The recognition of these small compromises provides opportunities for course correction before they develop into major vulnerabilities. The key is developing sufficient self-awareness to notice the subtle changes in attitude and expectation that signal the regeneration of the weak self. This requires the kind of honest self-examination that most people find uncomfortable, but which becomes natural for those who understand that psychological freedom is their most valuable possession. The cultivation of this ongoing self-awareness creates what might be called the observer self, a part of consciousness that watches the contents of experience without being identified with them. This observer notices when emotions arise without being controlled by them, observes when desires appear without being compelled by them, and recognizes when fears emerge without being paralyzed by them. The development of this observing capacity is perhaps the most important aspect of destroying the weak self because it provides the foundation for all other forms of psychological independence. The practice of meditation, regardless of its religious or philosophical context, serves primarily to strengthen this observing capacity. The meditator learns to watch thoughts and emotions come and go without being swept away by them. This simple skill, developed through consistent practice, gradually transforms one's relationship to all mental and emotional content. What previously seemed solid and compelling begins to appear as temporary and optional. The dramas that once seemed desperately important reveal themselves as passing shows that need not define one's identity or determine one's actions. This transformation of perspective creates what could be called existential humor, the ability to see the cosmic comedy in human affairs while remaining seriously committed to one's chosen purposes. The person who has achieved this perspective can work diligently toward important goals while maintaining the detachment to laugh at the absurdity of his own efforts. He can care deeply about outcomes while recognizing that his happiness does not depend on their achievement. He can engage passionately with life while holding lightly to his engagements. This combination of engagement and detachment produces what observers often describe as a mysterious quality and ability to be fully present while somehow remaining untouchable. Such individuals can enter any social or professional environment and immediately become centers of attention, not through any effort to impress others, but simply through their obvious comfort with themselves. Their presence suggests possibilities that others had not considered, solutions that others had not seen, and ways of being that others had not imagined. The ultimate expression of this transformation is the development of what might be called creative indifference, the ability to generate value and beauty without attachment to recognition or reward. The artist who has achieved this state creates not to satisfy market demands or critical expectations, but from an internal compulsion to express truth as he perceives it. His work carries unusual power because it emerges from genuine vision rather than calculated effect. His influence grows because others sense the authenticity that comes from freedom from external pressure. The scientist who operates from this foundation pursues knowledge for its own sake rather than for career advancement or social recognition. Her research addresses questions that genuinely interest her rather than topics that promise funding or prestige. Her discoveries carry special weight because they emerge from disinterested observation rather than motivated reasoning. Her colleagues trust her conclusions because they know she has no agenda beyond understanding reality accurately. The entrepreneur who embodies this principle creates businesses that serve real needs rather than exploiting artificial desires. His companies succeed because they provide genuine value rather than manufactured necessity. His leadership inspires loyalty because employees sense that his vision serves something larger than his own ego. His innovations emerge from creative freedom rather than market pressure, often anticipating needs that customers themselves had not recognized. The cultivation of creative indifference requires destroying not only personal attachments but also social conditioning about the purpose of human effort. Most people work to achieve security, recognition, or pleasure goals that create psychological dependencies and limit creative potential. The person who would achieve true freedom must discover forms of motivation that exist independent of these conventional rewards. This requires developing an intimate relationship with the creative process itself, finding satisfaction in the quality of attention and effort rather than in external results. This shift from result-oriented to process-oriented motivation creates a paradoxical effect. The person who cares least about achieving conventional success often becomes the most successful by conventional measures. This occurs because creative indifference removes the psychological obstacles that prevent most people from reaching their full potential. Fear of failure no longer inhibits risk-taking. Desire for approval no longer distorts judgment. Need for security no longer prevents necessary change. The historical example of Leonardo da Vinci illustrates how creative indifference can produce achievements that seem impossible from conventional perspectives. Leonardo's notebooks reveal a mind that pursued knowledge and beauty with complete disregard for practical applications or social expectations. His investigations ranged from anatomy to engineering to art to philosophy, driven by insatiable curiosity rather than any external agenda. His greatest works emerged from this freedom to follow his interests wherever they led, unencumbered by the need to satisfy patrons or critics. Leonardo's approach to patronage demonstrates another aspect of the power that comes from needing nothing. While he accepted commissions and worked for various rulers, he maintained complete artistic independence by being willing to abandon projects that no longer interested him or that required compromises he was unwilling to make. His patrons tolerated this independence because they recognized that his greatest contributions emerged from his freedom rather than from their direction. They learned to support his vision rather than trying to control it. The modern equivalent might be the programmer who develops software because he enjoys solving complex problems rather than because he wants to become wealthy or famous. His programs are often more elegant and useful than those created by teams with larger budgets and more ambitious goals because his motivation keeps him focused on quality rather than quantity, on genuine functionality rather than impressive features. His work attracts attention and, eventually, financial success, but these results flow naturally from his creative freedom rather than being forced through strategic effort. The development of this kind of intrinsic motivation requires a fundamental re-examination of one's relationship to work and achievement. Most people view effort as a necessary evil that must be endured to achieve desired outcomes. The person who would achieve true independence must discover how to find satisfaction in effort itself, independent of its results. This requires developing what might be called craftsmanship consciousness and appreciation for the quality of attention and skill that goes into any task, regardless of its apparent importance or social recognition. The carpenter who has achieved craftsmanship consciousness takes the same care with a hidden joint that will never be seen as with the surface that will be admired. His satisfaction comes from knowing that he has done excellent work rather than from others' appreciation of that work. This internal standard of quality becomes a source of freedom because it is completely under his control, unlike external recognition which depends on factors beyond his influence. The writer who operates from this foundation focuses on the precision of language and the accuracy of observation rather than on sales figures or critical reviews. Her satisfaction comes from the process of discovering exactly the right word for each thought, of finding the structure that allows complex ideas to become clear, of achieving the transparency of style that allows readers to see through her words to the reality she is describing. These internal rewards sustain her through the inevitable periods of external rejection or indifference. The physician who has developed craftsmanship consciousness approaches each patient with the same careful attention whether the case is routine or complex, whether the patient is prominent or humble. His fulfillment comes from the exercise of diagnostic skill, from the satisfaction of providing healing, from the privilege of serving human need in its most vulnerable moments. These intrinsic rewards make him independent of external recognition while motivating him to continuous improvement. The cultivation of craftsmanship consciousness begins with choosing some area of activity and committing to excellence in that domain regardless of external rewards or recognition. The key is selecting something that provides immediate feedback about quality, allowing one to develop genuine rather than imaginary standards. Physical crafts are often ideal for this purpose because the quality of workmanship is immediately apparent and cannot be faked or rationalized. The piece of furniture either fits together perfectly or it does not. The garden either thrives or it does not. The meal either tastes good or it does not. This practice of pursuing excellence for its own sake gradually transforms one's relationship to all activities. The habit of caring about quality independent of recognition becomes generalized, creating an internal compass that guides behavior regardless of external circumstances. The person who has developed this internal guidance system becomes increasingly independent of others' opinions while becoming increasingly valuable to others through the quality of his contributions. The final stage of this transformation involves understanding that the destruction of the weak self and the cultivation of inner independence are not ends in themselves but foundations for service to something larger than personal survival and satisfaction. The man who truly needs nothing discovers that he has been freed to give everything to causes and relationships that have genuine meaning rather than merely personal benefit. His independence becomes the basis for deeper engagement rather than withdrawal from human affairs. This paradox resolves the apparent contradiction between self-development and service to others. The person who has achieved genuine independence is no longer driven by unconscious needs that might compromise his judgment or corrupt his motivations. He can serve others without expecting gratitude, lead without requiring followers, and love without demanding reciprocation. His freedom from personal agenda allows him to see clearly what situations actually require rather than what would make him feel good about himself. The great leaders throughout history have embodied this principle. They achieved their influence by becoming independent of the very things they had power over. Washington could lead effectively because he didn't need to be president. Lincoln could preserve the Union because he wasn't attached to his own political survival. Gandhi could challenge the British Empire because he required nothing that they could withhold. In each case, the leader's freedom from personal need created space for others to change their behavior voluntarily rather than being coerced by force or manipulation. This understanding transforms the entire purpose of self-development from a narcissistic focus on personal improvement to a preparation for meaningful contribution. The destruction of the weak self becomes not an end but a beginning, the clearing away of psychological obstacles that prevent genuine service to life. The man who needs nothing finally becomes capable of giving everything, not from compulsion or guilt, but from the natural overflow of a life that has discovered its proper function. In the end, the silent power of the man who needs nothing emerges not from his independence but from his freedom to choose his dependencies consciously rather than being enslaved by them unconsciously. He serves what he loves rather than what he fears, acts from principle rather than reaction, and creates value rather than merely consuming it. His invulnerability becomes not a wall that separates him from others but a foundation that allows him to engage more deeply and authentically with the challenges and opportunities that life provides. The transformation from weakness to strength, from dependency to independence, from reaction to conscious action, represents perhaps the highest achievement available to human beings. It requires everything we have to give but offers in return something beyond price, the capacity to live as free beings in a world that would reduce us to our fears and appetites. The man who achieves this transformation discovers that he has not lost his humanity but found it, not escaped from life but learned how to live it fully. His power lies not in what he can control but in what he can choose, not in what he can demand but in what he can offer, not in what he needs but in what he has become capable of giving. This is the silent power that Machiavelli observed but perhaps never fully understood, the strange authority that emerges when a human being accepts complete responsibility for his own experience while maintaining complete availability to serve what life requires. It cannot be faked, borrowed, or inherited. It can only be earned through the patient work of destroying everything in oneself that is false in order to discover what remains when all illusions have been abandoned. What remains is more than enough.